welcome to Quilt Addicts Anonymous. I'm Stephanie Soebbing, and today I'm going to show you how to make block 6 in the Kaleidoscope Block of the Month. For this month and the rest of the months in this quilt, we're going to be making loads of half square triangles. So I'm going to show you at the beginning of each month how to do the half square triangle, and then we'll show you how to assemble that month's block. So we're just going to show you how to do one half square triangle, even though pretty much all the blocks are made of them, because if you can do one, you can do the rest. If you would like to follow along with Kaleidoscope Block of the Month, you can do so by getting your pattern book at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com, or you may be able to get it and the fabric from Northcott Gradations from your local quilt shop. This is available at quilt shops across the U.S. and Canada, so you might be able to find it locally. I know there are a lot of quilt shops that are hosting Block of the Months and planning to do so in the future. So, this one has almost all the colors that we're going to be using going forward, because it kind of sets up the color changes that are going to happen for the rest of those setting squares. So block 6 is actually a setting triangle, so it's not actually a full complete block. It's 16 half setting triangles, which sort of set the tone for the rest of the quilt. So you're going to have a bunch of regular triangles that we're going to set in at the end. And then we have a bunch of squares that we're going to make half square triangles from. I said it in the last video, but I will say it again. I love making half square triangles from squares. I always size up the math a little bit. If you're going to do it perfect, you can cut it to 7/8 of an inch larger than your finished square, and you will end up with the right size half square triangle. But let's face it, who's perfect? So I always add an extra inch so that we have plenty to trim down, and then we end up with perfect half square triangles at the end, and all the points end up where they're supposed to be, and everything works out great. So we're going to show you how to do that today, and then we'll be able to put this setting block together. So I'm going to start by making a line from corner to corner on the wrong side of my square. And this is going to be the line that we're going to use as a reference when we sew down it. And you can see this is obviously the 60-degree triangle. It does not belong in the quilt, but it's a straight edge I have on hand, and that's really all you need. So then you're going to lay it right sides together with what's going to become the other half of your half square triangle. In this case, it's our black fabric. Now we're going to move over to the sewing machine, and right now I have it set up to sew a regular 1/4 inch stitch. But when I'm sewing half square triangles, I like to make it a scant 1/4 inch stitch to give me just a little bit extra room so that I definitely have plenty to trim off and I can have a perfect size square and half square triangle when I'm done. So to do that, I move my needle with one position to the right, and that moves it closer to that line that we drew. So what I'm going to do here is I'm lining up the edge of my presser foot. Normally we would have this in line with the edge of our fabric, but we have to pretend that the line is the edge of our fabric here because it will be once we cut it off. So I'm lining it up with that line, and I'm going to sew my scant 1/4 inch seam all the way down this half of the triangle. Then when I'm done, you can change PCs if you're doing a bunch of them, which you will be for this quilt. I'm going to flip it around, and now I'm going to sew down the other side of that line. So now we can take our straight edge, and we're going to put it so that it is right on top of where that line is. And then I'm going to cut right down the line. And if you're not perfectly on top of the line, it's okay. We already have our accuracy from when we sewed a scant 1/4 inch away from it. But you don't want to be either too close or too far away, because if your seam gets too skinny, it can pop open when it's on the long arm, and we don't want that. So now we're going to take this half square triangle and we're going to press the seams open. And I sort of changed my mind on pressing seams. I used to press them to the dark side, and then when I started doing more long arm quilting and I realized how difficult it is to quilt into those corners when you have a lot of seam like that, I started quilting them open, and I really like the results that I get from start to finish. So that is what I do now. So we're almost done here. Now we just have to trim this up. So we just need one of these. And when I'm working with smaller squares like this, I like to use my 4.5 inch ruler. I find that it's really helpful at not having too much extra to work with and worry about. So to trim a half square triangle, you want to align the 45-degree line on your ruler with your seam allowance, and that will make sure that your points are right where they're supposed to be at the tips. And you want to make sure that you have got a little bit extra hanging off the seam where it's supposed to be. So in this case, I'm trimming to 3.5, so I have fabric beyond the 3.5 inch line. And then I also have fabric hanging off on the other side that I'm going to trim. So I'm going to hold this ruler in place, and I'm going to trim up the sides. Now I have a nice trimmed edge. My point goes all the way to the corner where it's supposed to be. Now I'm going to flip that around, and this time I'm going to line the cut edge up exactly with the line it's supposed to be. So 3.5 inches, it's right on there. My 45-degree line is still right on that seam allowance, so we can keep the point where it's supposed to be. Now we're going to trim this, and we actually didn't trim that much off that top, but it really makes a huge difference, and we'll show you. So here's the one we trimmed, and here's the one that I haven't trimmed yet. So you can see that this is a lot neater, it's a little bit smaller, and so even though it takes some time to trim all these, it's definitely worth it because you're going to get a quilt that fits a lot better together at the end, and it's going to look fabulous, and your points will be exactly where they're supposed to be. So go ahead and follow along with your Kaleidoscope pattern book so that you make the right amount of blue and green half square triangles. And then we're going to come back and we're going to finish this block up, and I'll show you how to put it together into rows to complete your setting triangle. Alright, so you should have all your half square triangles made and laid out according to the diagram in your pattern book for Kaleidoscope, the block of the month from Quilt Addicts Anonymous. So I'm going to show you how to sew together this long row, because if you can do the long row, you can do the others because they're shorter. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put these right sides together, and I'm going to line up my corners here, and this point is going to be hanging off the edge. We want that to happen. We're actually going to sew, our seam allowance should be right about where the seams come together. So I'm going to move my stitch length back over to a regular 1/4 inch seam. We don't need the scant 1/4 inch seam anymore. That is just for sewing your half square triangles. Alright, so let's get that stitch down. And while I'm doing this, I'm also going to flip up the next one, right sides together, and bring that over to the sewing machine as well. You certainly can pin this if you want to. How much you pin is really kind of a matter of preference. Certainly there are some seams that have to be pinned, but there are others like these where you're just putting 2 squares together, where it really is up to you and what you want to do. So now we're going to press these. And basically you just need to press it so that every other row is going in the opposite direction. So you'll see what I mean here. So for this first row, we're going to press it so that everything is going up, and then when we do the second row, we'll press it so that everything's going down, and that will make these seam joints a whole lot easier when we're all done with everything. Alright, so we got these flipped right sides together, and we're going to sew them together using our 1/4 inch seam allowance. And again, you can pin if you want to, you certainly don't have to. So that's looking pretty good. We've got everything going in the right direction. We have our little dog here hanging off here, which is exactly how we want it to be. So now if I lay this, you can see that everything's still going in the diagonal the way it's supposed to be. So now we need to sew row 2 together, and this time we're going to press the seams so that they're going down. So this one's a little different in that we can't really sew it together in twosies because there's only 3 blocks in the entire row, because we get 1 less block for each row. So first I'm just going to sew this one together. And whenever I am sewing something where everything has to be in like the exact right spot, I always like to go lay it back down next to it to make sure everything looks right before I sew anything together. This lessens the possibility of me accidentally sewing something in the wrong spot or in the wrong direction, and then you have to rip and tear it out, and nobody likes to do that. So now I know that that's the right way. So before pressing, I'm just going to go ahead and sew this one on, and then I can press them all at once to save some time. So on this first row, we pressed all our seams up. So on this one, we want to make sure that they're all going down. So I'm going to go ahead and flip that over and start doing that. So I'm going to start with the first one in the block and sew that together. Or press that down rather. And then I can take this, and my seams are going to butt up real nice next to each other because we took the time to press them in the opposite direction. And remember this for when we're putting together the final setting triangle at the end, because you're basically going to be putting this together but on a much larger scale, where instead of 3-inch finished blocks, you have 12-inch finished blocks that you're working with. So I am just lining these up so that the seams are sort of butting right next to each other, as they're both pressed in the opposite direction, so they kind of just snug right in there. And now when I sew this together, you can see where the seam line hits the diagonal of your seam. I want to be just to the right of where the seam line is and where this little triangle is in the seam. And that'll make sure that my points don't get cut off and they're right where they're supposed to be. Slow down just a little bit when I get to that seam allowance, so I can make sure I get my needle where I want it, so I don't lose that point. And now when I'm sewing, my needle should be coming out right where those 2 points are coming together, as that should indicate where your 1/4 inch seam allowance should be. Alright, now it's time for the moment of truth to see how these points turn out, and the answer is pretty good. These are pretty much perfect. This one you can see just the teeniest little bit of black, but it's going to be fine, because when this is all quilted and you have texture, you're not going to see that. So that's one I'm just going to leave. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm really happy with all these points turn out. And again, it's because we pressed those seams in opposite directions and we paid attention to where we were stitching. So now all you have to do is sew this to this, and then you can sew your triangle to that row, and then sew your halves together to complete your block. So this is it. This is our block 6 for the Kaleidoscope Block of the Month. These are setting triangles, so this is what will help us be able to put the rest of the quilt, do the corners without having to actually put it on point. So I know that probably didn't make sense, but I promise it will when we put it all together, and if you take a peek ahead to look at the assembly diagram, it'll make sense. So when you're doing this, and if you're doing it as a month by month across the course of a year, this is a bias seam, and so if you're putting them away, or if there's any chance that they might get handled, it might be a good idea to sew a little stay stitch seam along the edge of this seam within the seam allowance. So what that means is you're going to set your sewing machine to like 1/8 of an inch seam, and you're going to stitch as close to the edge of this as you can. And what that does is it makes sure that the size that this is now is a size that it will stay. Because if it gets handled or if it gets messed around with as you're showing your blocks off at your sewing retreat or anything, then this edge can stretch, because the bias is a stretchier part of the fabric than this outside edge. So just run a quick line of stitching through here, and that will make sure that everything stays the way it's supposed to, and you're able to put the quilt together the way you want at the end of the year. If you want, you also can trim off these dog ears. It makes for a little bit cleaner assembly at the end. But that's it. That's block 6. It's pretty simple. Like I said, we're doing half square triangles from here on out, so any beginner can do this quilt. I know it looks really complicated, but it isn't when you break it down. Thanks so much for following along. Make sure to go to shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com to get your copy of the Kaleidoscope Block of the Month book. You can also get it at your local quilt shop if they carry it. There are a lot of shops across the U.S. and Canada that are doing this as a Block of the Month. And the fabric is Stonehenge Gradations by Northcott. Thanks so much for following along, and happy quilting.